Unbelievable, MicroStrategy is now officially listed on Nasdaq. Michael Saylor confirms this, and we'll see MicroStrategy listed on Nasdaq in just a few days. This means we're going to see massive passive inflows to MicroStrategy through the Nasdaq index. This also means that millions of people now have indirect Bitcoin exposure through Nasdaq. All the Bitcoin skeptics now have indirect Bitcoin exposure. That's ultra bullish. On one hand, it's the next step in Bitcoin adoption. On the internet, this action or this news is being treated as the second most important news after the Bitcoin ETF approvals. Some say this is the second most important thing that's happened this year after the Bitcoin ETFs. And because this is really a crowning achievement, we've never had anything like this where a Bitcoin company is listed on Nasdaq right alongside Apple, Tesla, and Google. And the difference is, Tesla has Bitcoin and is listed on Nasdaq, but MicroStrategy is a Bitcoin-first company that has completely restructured its entire corporate purpose around Bitcoin. Big congratulations to Michael Saylor, who has really managed to build one of the most profitable ventures in the whole world with MicroStrategy in connection with Bitcoin. And he really deserves to be included in Nasdaq now. MicroStrategy will be added to the Nasdaq 100 starting December 23rd. December, added to the Nasdaq 100. And now we need to pay attention to the following. New capital is coming into MicroStrategy. Here, there are various estimates. Most estimates are between 3 and 2 billion, which is the new capital coming in. This means MicroStrategy can buy even more Bitcoin, effectively increasing the Bitcoin per share ratio. That's what makes MicroStrategy so special. It's the only company, or almost the only company in the world, that's continually increasing the Bitcoin per share allocation. That means you have an increasingly larger share of Bitcoin per share. MicroStrategy has now accumulated over Bitcoin, and this Bitcoin holding is being massively pumped up by this news and by this listing on Nasdaq. And the funny thing is, all the 70-30 portfolio investors who say 70% MSCI World, 30% emerging markets, or the 60-40 portfolio people who say, yes, we do 60% stocks, 40% bonds. All those boomer investors who are kind of sneaking around with their 7 or 8% returns, thinking they're good investors when they can barely keep up with inflation. If we really subtract the actual inflation plus taxes, fees, and everything else you have to deduct, all those boomer investors are now going to indirectly own Bitcoin. And even if someone said for a long time, no, I don't want to buy Bitcoin, just leave me alone, I'd rather stick with my MSCI World, or I prefer my savings account or something like that. Even those people are now being forced to include Bitcoin in their portfolios. Otherwise, they'd have to kick MSCI World out of their portfolio and start picking single stocks. But at some point, all companies, or not all companies, but more and more companies will have Bitcoin. That's why it's getting harder and harder to have no Bitcoin exposure at all. I've just listed a whole bunch of names for you of Bitcoin critics who are now going to own Bitcoin because of this MicroStrategy listing. Paul Krugman now owns Bitcoin, Nouriel Roubini owns Bitcoin, Jamie Dimon owns Bitcoin, Jerome Powell owns Bitcoin, Elizabeth Warren owns Bitcoin, and even Christine Lagarde probably owns Bitcoin. Now, that's super bullish. Shout out to all the Bitcoin critics. You have to be a bit careful with the whole situation because MicroStrategy is being listed on Nasdaq, and there's a requirement that you can't be a financial company, meaning you can't just be a pure financial firm. Eric Balchunas and Jeff Seifer have indeed already warned that it could potentially even happen in the coming months that MicroStrategy might get delisted again if they focus too much on the financial business in the near future. Michael Saylor, not MicroStrategy. Michael Saylor says he wants to become a Bitcoin bank, and that could definitely become a problem. Additionally, there's another important topic here, and that's the FASB regulation. If fair value accounting becomes mandatory, then it could be that this gets undermined. Additionally, something similar could happen. The big final boss is the 500, and this is now the entrance gate. But it could also very well lead to the situation where if MicroStrategy keeps pumping the Bitcoin price, and of course also boosting their own company, then it could definitely happen that MicroStrategy gets included in the S&P 500. 500 is recorded. And this is an even bigger listing because a lot more capital comes in compared to the Nasdaq 100. And that would push the Bitcoin price even more. It would boost MicroStrategy. And that's how the whole infinite money glitch loop would work even better. I already explained this in the last video, the infinite money glitch that Michael Saylor is running. So basically, you have Bitcoin on the balance sheet, which means when the Bitcoin price goes up, what happens? The company valuation goes up too, and then you can dilute the stock shares. By diluting the stock shares, you can buy more Bitcoin, then the Bitcoin price goes up, then the company value goes up, and then you can improve even more stock shares. More investors come in, you have even more capital, and then the whole loop gets expanded by eventually getting listed on Nasdaq after reaching certain thresholds, and eventually also in the the 500, and that brings more and more capital to MicroStrategy, and you can leverage it more and more. You can buy more and more Bitcoin, the FOMO is getting bigger and bigger, and you simply have a massively leveraged Bitcoin company, which on the other hand, of course, also has a certain risk because it is massively dependent on the Bitcoin price. They don't really have a solid business field anymore. The main business of MicroStrategy now is to leverage Bitcoin. Matt Eugen made a very interesting statement here. He is basically the CEO of Bitwise, who also have a Bitcoin ETF. He says that when Bitcoin hits the $1 million mark, investors will look back and wonder how they could have missed such obvious signs. And now he's listing a bunch of things that, in hindsight, people will say, wow, how could I have been so dumb to overlook that? Here's the whole list. The former and future president of the United States is giving the keynote speech at the Bitcoin conference. BlackRock recommends a 2% allocation of Bitcoin in portfolios. Bitcoin ETFs are the most successful ETF launches of all time by a factor of 6. Investors like Ray Dalio say you should own Bitcoins. Incredible investments always seem obvious in hindsight. Bitcoin is screaming right now, watch what you're doing. So this is a very clear message. The signs are here, Bitcoin is here to win. Things like a strategic Bitcoin reserve haven't even been mentioned yet. We now have corporate adoption with MicroStrategy, which is really a massive event, huge news, you can't emphasize that enough. You can really say, applause for Michael Saylor, thank you Michael Saylor, awesome what you've built here. But of course, we don't want to idolize anyone because Bitcoin doesn't need leaders. It doesn't need a Michael Saylor. On the flip side, there's always the risk of centralization, and there are definitely people who, for example, who see it very critically, like FTX collapsed in 2021. MicroStrategy might face a similar fate, with a 60 to 70% drawdown, risking a margin call. Even if Bitcoin drops to $1, it won't destroy MicroStrategy. But centralization risks remain. CC, Binance founder, mentioned that big nations will buy Bitcoin and adopt a reserve strategy while printing their own money. I don't think that's such a problem. Even if Bitcoin were to somehow fall to or US dollar, that wouldn't destroy MicroStrategy. But of course I understand the concerns that there are centralization risks here and much more. There was another really interesting statement from CC, the founder of Binance. I'm not sure if he said this at the MENA conference in Abu Dhabi or if it was a separate statement, but I think it was actually a separate statement. He said that nations, big nations, will buy Bitcoin, implement a Bitcoin reserve strategy, and print their own money. Michael Saylor's strategy often faces criticism for seemingly printing money, taking on debt, and buying Bitcoin. Technically, this isn't entirely accurate. He's issuing convertible bonds, which are options to buy stock at a lower price later. This involves using various financial products to leverage Bitcoin's price. He's borrowed from banks before and employs multiple mechanisms to leverage Bitcoin. While technically not traditional debt, it functions similarly, sourced from financial markets or convertible bond buyers. What he's doing is using different products to leverage the Bitcoin price. He's also borrowed money from a bank before. He has 2, 3, or 4 different mechanisms to leverage Bitcoin. So, in my opinion, it definitely is leveraging. Technically, you might say, yeah, it's not debt or anything, but it is debt. It just might not be from a bank. Instead, the debt comes from, let's say, the financial market or from people who buy the convertible bonds. And CC is clearly saying that nation-states will print money to buy Bitcoin. And Michael Saylor is doing this on a smaller scale. That's why I always say, Michael Saylor is basically creating the blueprint for what could happen on a national level if the US builds a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And you could see it, Michael Saylor started off buying relatively small amounts of Bitcoin. Of course. From back then, what Michael Saylor bought was crazy. But looking at it now, he really went all in. Over the last 3 or 4 months, buying Bitcoin and stuff like that on a daily basis. At first, it was like 1,000 Bitcoin, then 5,000 Bitcoin, and back then we thought that was a lot. And now he's just throwing in Bitcoin like it's nothing every day. But you have to say, he doesn't buy it all in one day. The news comes out that Michael Saylor bought Bitcoin. However, he did not buy the Bitcoin all at once, but rather he usually buys them over a longer period of time, idachi, over a week or 2, just to get the best prices and not create too much slippage. That's why you usually stretch out massive purchases over several weeks, and then the news comes out, Yeah, I just bought Bitcoin. But then on the day he makes the announcement, the Bitcoin price doesn't actually go up because the purchases were already made in the past. And that's exactly how it should ideally happen with a strategic Bitcoin reserve. For example, you can buy. The US isn't going to buy Bitcoin over a 2-week period, but maybe over a 2 or 3 year span. Then they'll make the announcement like, hey, we just bought some Bitcoin, and here are the Bitcoins we've accumulated over that 3-year period. And MicroStrategy is doing it similarly, and that's how the US will likely approach it if they actually decide to invest in Bitcoin. Or maybe they've already been investing in Bitcoin for a while and will only announce it in a few months. I also need to mention something here that's important for a lot of people, especially those who are new to this. There's a difference between buying MicroStrategy, which gives you leveraged Bitcoin, and buying Bitcoin directly. When you buy MicroStrategy, you always have third-party risk. It's treated like a stock, which means that in Germany, Bitcoin is tax-free after a year, but that's not the case with MicroStrategy. I would always recommend that if you're new to Bitcoin, get actual Bitcoin first before you start messing around with any side vehicles like MicroStrategy or Bitcoin ETFs. Because only if you have real Bitcoin do you have censorship-resistant money that's available 24/7. MicroStrategy is more of a proxy here, a vehicle to give access to Bitcoin to investors or large capital who, for regulatory reasons, cannot hold Bitcoin directly. Of course, you can say you want to benefit from the leverage of MicroStrategy, and that's totally legit. But if it's really just about having hard, unassailable money, then you should always prefer buying Bitcoin directly. I'll also give you a link below on how you can easily buy Bitcoin directly from Bitcoin, send it directly to your hardware wallet, and have it be your own heart, completely self-sufficient. Here, with the code Bitcoin Hotel, you can even get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. And now, get ready. I'm about to show you my ultra bullish Bitcoin to the moon jump from the waterfall here in El Salvador. Check it out. I'm signing off.